Christian Heroes Then and Now. Eric Liddell. Something Greater Than Gold by Janet and Geoff Benge. The Courtyard of the Happy Way, Chapter 15. At 7:30 p.m. on March 30th, 1943, the last group of people left in the British concession gathered near the guardhouse. There were about 300 of them, and they looked like a group of rich tourists going on an outing. Many of the women wore heavy mink coats and fashionable high heels. Under their coats, they wore beautifully tailored woolen suits. Pearl necklaces and diamond earrings completed their outfits. The men wore suits with starch-collared shirts and striped ties. They all seemed to have far too much luggage with them. There were piles of beach chairs, hat boxes, canteens of silver cutlery, even a set of golf clubs. Eric couldn't help but smile to himself as he viewed the sight. They all seemed to have such different ideas of what they would find at the end of their journey. And these ideas were reflected in how the people dressed and what they brought with them. A few small children wove in and out of the group as they waited. Some of the timid children clutched well-worn teddy bears or held their mother's hands tightly. The more adventurous ones clambered over the piles of belongings. They all waited for an hour before the Japanese commander finally arrived and began barking orders. "Everyone, pick up belongings and proceed to railway station. Follow that guard," he yelled. A gasp went up from the group. Did the Japanese really expect them to carry all of their luggage themselves? It was 3 miles to the railway station. "How dare they?" whispered one well-dressed woman to her husband. "Tell him we want to hire a Chinese servant to carry our luggage for us." Eric watched as her husband shook his head. "We'll just have to leave what we cannot manage, Ethel," he replied glumly. "Now!" bellowed the Japanese commander above the noise of the crowd. "Go now! Hurry, hurry!" Eric picked up his 2 bags and began the trek to the train station. He felt grateful, in a way. He had lived out on the Great Plain and had experienced the hardship of war firsthand. He had gone hungry, been shot at, and slept on dirt floors. Most of the people around him had never experienced anything like it. Most of them had led pampered colonial lives. They'd had servants to do their washing, servants to run their baths, servants to make their beds and cook their meals. They'd had chauffeurs to run their wives to bridge parties and chauffeurs to pick up their children from exclusive private schools. For every task they had found unpleasant, boring, or time-consuming, there had been a Chinese servant pleased to earn a few pennies doing it. But that lifestyle had come to an abrupt end, and Eric wondered how these people were going to adjust to the new life that lay ahead of them. The group trudged through the gates of the British concession for the last time. Eric glanced behind him. A pile of belongings sat by the side of the road. Virtually everything that Eric or anyone else in the group owned, if it had not been sent ahead to the camp, had been abandoned. Hand-carved mahogany dining tables, glistening chandeliers, collections of hunting rifles, and libraries filled with first-edition leather-bound books had all been left behind. Within days, it would all be looted from their houses and sold on the black market. Eric walked in silence. Many of the women around him wept quietly as they marched in 2 lines down the street. Chinese people stood on both sides of the road. Many of them bowed slightly as the foreigners straggled by. The Chinese people were in a difficult position. Most of them resented the concessions and the way foreigners made so much money off their country. But at the same time, the British were their allies against the Japanese. In this war, at least, The two were on the same side. It took an hour for the group to reach the station. Once there, they were told to wait for the train that would take them on the 400-mile journey to Wysine internment camp. No one said much as the train puffed into view, pulling a row of third-class carriages. When the train came to a halt, the British prisoners were herded inside. Too many people were crammed into the filthy carriages for anyone to get comfortable. Some people sat on suitcases while others perched on straight-backed wooden benches. Babies cried and toddlers whined for their beds and their dinners. Eric sat on his bags in the aisle and watched his fellow travelers. They were all British. They spoke English, and they were all on their way to an internment camp. But that was all they had in common with each other. All of them were from varied walks of life and social classes. Many of them had never, ever before had to mix with each other. Now they sat silently, side by side, staring grimly out of the darkness that had settled over the countryside. Eric prayed silently as the train rolled along through the night. God, help me to shine your light among these people. The train took 16 exhausting hours to reach Wysine. Stiff and sleepless, the passengers climbed awkwardly from the train. They were then told the internment camp was 2 miles outside the city. Whispers went around the group. According to those who had visited Wysine before, they were probably going to be interned at the American Presbyterian Mission Station just outside of town. Since there were no trucks to take them the 2 miles to the camp, once again, they all picked up their luggage and began to walk. Eric shifted his luggage from one hand to the other as he walked along. Then, finally, the gate to the American Presbyterian Mission Station came into view. The rumor was true. This was where they were going to be interned. As Eric walked up to the gate, he noticed the sign in Chinese hanging above it. He translated it out loud as he walked under it. The courtyard of the Happy Way. No one was happy to be in the courtyard that night. Inside the gates, Japanese guards led the group along a pathway between 2 buildings and out into a small open field with a rugby goalpost at one end. When the group had gathered on the field, one of the guards pointed to a tall, dark-haired European man with glasses. The men stepped in front of the group and turned to address it. Welcome to Wysine internment camp, he began in a clipped English accent. I know you will have many questions, but the one thing we have here is plenty of time to answer them. He gave a little chuckle at his own joke, but no one else seemed to find it funny. He continued, for now, I am going to tell you that including yourselves, there are about 1,800 of us here. We come from 3 cities. Peking, Singto, and of course, Tientsin. We are placed in dormitories according to where we come from, and there are 3 kitchens within the compound. So each group gets to cook for itself and eat together. Now, if you would separate into families on the right and singles on the left, we can get you settled into a room, and then you can have your dinner. Eric shuffled to the left. In some ways, he envied the people on the right. They were families and could comfort and support each other. But in other ways, he hated the thought of his wife and daughters being in an internment camp. One more thing, said the man, raising his clipped English voice above the crowd. The bathrooms are to your right in the long, low building. They're not in great shape yet. His voice trailed off apologetically. Eric and 5 other men were directed to one of the dormitory buildings. One of the men was A.P. Cullen, who had been a teacher at Eltham College in London when Eric was a young student there. A.P. Cullen had also been a fellow teacher with Eric at the Anglo-Chinese College. On the way to the dormitory, the men stopped by the bathrooms. Eric almost wished they hadn't. He had been in China long enough to experience many types of bathrooms, but the one he saw or smelled when he opened the door was 100 times worse than anything he'd seen before. It was easy to see the bathrooms had once been the sparkling clean pride of the janitor of the Presbyterian mission station. The toilet bowls were all new and sunk low into the ground, like all Chinese toilets. Above each bowl dangled a polished bronze chain, which, when pulled, should have produced a flush of water. But therein was the problem. All the water pipes in the toilet had been ripped out, and the toilet bowls were already backed up and overflowing. A man in the bathroom explained that there was no running water in the whole camp, no plumber to repair the pipes, and no Chinese servants to clean up the mess. At that moment, Eric grasped the enormity of what lay ahead. Somehow, the 1,800 people interned in the camp, cut off from families, friends, and countries, would have to find a way to work together to form a community. It was going to have to be a community where many people would need to do jobs they had never even dreamed of doing before. They were going to have to cook meals, clean toilets, pump water, and hand wash clothes. Eric sighed. It was going to be quite an unusual experience for many of the people in the camp who were used to being pampered by Chinese servants. Eric did not spend long in his new dorm room. There was absolutely no furniture in the room and no sign of the bed he had loaded onto a Japanese truck several days before in Tientsin. He shoved his bags up against a wall and headed outside again. It had turned into a cloudy, damp night, and he could hear people coughing as he walked past the doors to other dorm rooms. The beam of a searchlight mounted on the compound wall constantly crisscrossed the camp. As it moved across the area outside the dormitory, it illuminated a pile of shattered furniture and bent pipes. The Japanese had apparently completely demolished the compound before making it an internment camp. Eric stepped past the pile of broken furniture and walked to the wall at the north end of the compound. He decided to measure the compound. His years of running had made him fairly accurate at measuring distances with strides. He stared at the corner of the north wall and walked into a westerly direction. 1, 2, 3. He counted aloud until he reached the opposite corner. 150 yards. Then he strode along the west wall in a southerly direction. 200 yards. Eric let out a low whistle. The entire compound was only 150 yards wide and 200 yards long. That was only the size of 2 rugby fields. And into that space were packed 1,800 people. The realization shocked Eric. How could people get any privacy when they were crowded in so tightly? And how long were they going to have to remain crammed together in the camp? Eric was still thinking about this when A.P. Collin grabbed his arm. "You'd better get in line for dinner or you'll miss out," he said, pulling Eric towards a pole of light. Soon Eric was in line with 500 other people. They were all from Tientsin, and they were all hungry. Only those who had carried food with them from the British concession had eaten anything in the past 24 hours, and Eric was not one of them. Slowly the line edged towards a woman with a huge pot of liquid that she was ladling into bowls. "Where do you get the bowls?" Eric asked a man in front of him. "You bring them with you, of course," he replied, producing his own bowl from a bag he had slung over his shoulder. Eric and A.P. Collin looked at each other and groaned. Why hadn't they noticed sooner? They had been standing in line for a half hour by then. They both slipped out of line and walked quickly back to their room. Fortunately, both of them had plates and silverware packed away in their bags. Others, though, were not so lucky. They had not packed any plates and had to find people who would lend them some so they could eat. Their plight got Eric wondering. He might have brought plates, but what other important things had he forgotten to bring? When he got back to the line, it was moving more quickly, and within 10 minutes he and A.P. Cullen were sitting with their backs against a brick wall eating soup and chunks of bread. Eric looked around. This was the kind of meal most of the British people from the concession would have refused to eat had it been served to them at home or in a restaurant. Now they had no choice. Now they were prisoners in an internment camp surrounded by high walls and barbed wire. After dinner, Eric and A.P. Cullen, along with just about everyone else in the camp, headed for bed. Those who had arrived by train that day were exhausted. Most had hardly slept the night before. Eric slept in his clothes on the hard floor. There seemed little point changing into pajamas when there was no bed to curl up in. The next morning, Eric got up an hour earlier than everyone else, and as he did each morning, he used the time to read his Bible and pray. At exactly 7:15 a.m., a horn blared out, signaling that it was 15 minutes to roll call. Eric pulled on an extra sweater and headed outside. It was a crisp morning, and he was eager to learn more about the camp in the light of day. Eric learned a lot that first day. He learned that at least 15 nationalities were represented in the camp. The one thing they had in common was that the Japanese army did not want them moving freely around China anymore. As expected, there were large numbers of people from Great Britain and the United States, but there were also people from Italy, Belgium, Holland, India, Palestine, Russia, and Cuba. Some had lived most of their lives in China. Some were the children or grandchildren of merchants and businessmen who had immigrated to China many years before. Others, like the jazz duo consisting of a native Hawaiian and a black American, or the two Cuban families who had been touring China with a baseball team, had intended to visit the country for only a couple of weeks. They were stunned to find themselves prisoners in an internment camp. The Cuban families spoke only Spanish and had no one else to talk to. As Eric acquired this information, he realized that language was going to be a major problem in the camp. It would be very difficult to organize things when people did not understand what was being said. Eric also learned that inside the compound, the Japanese had decided to let them all pretty much alone. They had made it clear, though, that they wanted those in the camp to do their own chores and run their own affairs. By the end of his first day, Eric knew that this was going to be an extremely difficult task. How would people be motivated to work, and how would their spirits be kept up? In particular, Eric worried about the hundreds of children and teenagers he had seen that day. What was there for them to do week after week? And what about the schooling they were missing? But as he wondered, Eric's mind kept coming back to the unanswered question that really mattered. The question that was on everyone's mind. How long were they all going to be crammed together in Wycene internment camp? No one that day could have imagined that they would be interned for 2 years and 1 month, and that during that time they would become a community of people who learned to work together for the common good of everyone in the camp. And they certainly could not have predicted that the fate of the 43-year-old athlete, who would become one of the strongest and most willing workers within their prison community.